Good evening. My name's Ed Selich. I'm president of Speak Up Newport. Welcome you to our November program. Did you all enjoy the Thanksgiving dinner early tonight? All right. Yeah, thanks to the bungalow for providing that. I don't have a comment. We're being broadcast tonight on Zoom. We've got quite a few registrants on there. Also, we're on Channel 3 and Channel 852 on Cox. Channel 3 is on Spectrum. And if you're on Zoom and you have some difficulty, you can always go to your cable channel and watch live, or you can go on the city website. It's also on the city website. So we've got a great program tonight on the oil platforms offshore. We've got a great panel of speakers here, and I'm going to go ahead and introduce them, and they'll be speaking in this order. First of all, we have State Senator from District 37, David Min. He was elected in 2020 to represent Orange County's 37th District, which includes Anaheim Hills, Costa Mesa, Huntington Beach, Irvine, Laguna Beach, Laguna Woods, Lake Forest, Newport, Orange, Tustin, and Villa Park. He's a native Californian who resides in Irvine with his wife Jane and their 3 young kids. Before joining the state Senate, David was a law professor at UC Irvine. He's the son of Korean immigrants who grew up during the Korean War. They came to the United States in 1971. They got married and had 2 kids, David and his brother Andrew, who they raised here, and their story is the American dream. After graduating from Wharton and Harvard Law School, David began his career at the Securities and Exchange Commission. He went on to work for U.S. Senator Chuck Schumer as a senior economic policy advisor. He's a proud Eagle Scout, an ASYSO coach and referee, and he's active in his church in Irvine. Next to David, we have Garry Brown. Garry established Coastkeepers in 1999, and he serves as the organization's founding director. Under his leadership, Coastkeeper has become a powerful voice for water quality, marine habitats, and water supply issues in the region and throughout California. He's achieved numerous milestone successes through collaboration with stakeholders in scientific and legal research as a basis for his advocacy. He comes from a long background of building public-private partnerships. He served 5 years as assistant city manager for the city of Redlands, 10 years as an advocate and executive director for trade associations in the real estate and building industries, and served 2 terms as president of a chamber of commerce. He's a native of Orange County, and he's committed to expanding Coastkeeper's presence. He holds positions of leadership on so many boards and directors, I can't read them all off. Got a lot of them there, Garry. He also holds a BA in government from the University of Redlands. And then next to Garry, we've got David Kilpatrick, president of Kilpatrick Energy Group. They invest in oil and gas ventures and provide consulting services to the energy industry. He's been doing that for over 40 years. He's currently on the board of directors of Chineri Energy, a publicly traded company that is the largest exporter of liquefied natural gas in the United States. For over 20 years, he served on the boards of a dozen companies. Prior to that, he was president of Monterey Resources, the largest independent oil gas company in California. He's got a Bachelor of Science in Petroleum Engineering from the University of Southern California and a bachelor's degree in Geology and Physics from Whittier College. He's also served as president of the California Independent Petroleum Association and on the board of directors of Western States Petroleum Association. He's a resident of Newport Beach, and he's also a member of the Society of Petroleum Engineers. So David Kilpatrick. And then next to David is Mike Umbro. He's the founder of FieldView Capital Advisors. They're a boutique investment firm he founded in 2008. Through FieldView, he successfully raised over $100 million for upstream oil and gas developments. He continues to manage FieldView while serving as VP Corporate Development for RL Environmental and CFO for Premier Resource Management. Mike earned a bachelor's degree in economics from Pepperdine University, Master of Energy Business from the University of Tulsa, and Master of Environmental Management at Duke University School of the Environment. So, Michael Umbro. So I've got a lot of brain power here. I'm just tired reading those bios. So David, why don't you get started?
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Yeah, it's on. Thank you, Mayor Selich. So my name is Dave Min. I am a freshman senator representing this fine city, and I think based on what I'm seeing out of the redistricting maps, I'll continue to have the privilege of representing Newport Beach next year as well. I think Ed did a good job of giving my background. I basically spent my career in public policy, and I don't claim to be an expert on environment or oil platforms, although I'm learning a lot. But what I really have done with my career is think about policy issues and try to develop solutions to those. And that's what I've tried to do in my first year. Understanding the district that I represent and the importance of small businesses, we've gone out there, and in our first year, I think we've got some big wins on behalf of small businesses, both locally and around the state. SB 87 was a bill that I had the privilege of authoring this year, which created a $2.1 billion program for small businesses that had been negatively impacted by COVID-19, giving them grants of between $5,000 and $25,000. That's not working. All right, is that better? That's better. Okay. I could also just be louder, I suppose, but and that was a priority for us. We were able to work in concert with the Small Business Development Corporation, SBDC, to try to do workshops for small businesses throughout Orange County, and we did over 100 of those jointly with SBDC and other agencies. So helping small businesses through COVID and then hopefully beyond is a priority of mine. Just to give you a sense of what we're trying to do next, SB 430 is a bill by my Republican co-author, Andres Borges, who represents Fresno. It's a bill that I think is common sense that would create a process by which small businesses that inadvertently violated any of the myriad of regulations out there that had no harm to anybody. So inadvertent and no harm, small business, you'd get a waiver of that penalty or a reduction of that penalty. And it seems like common sense, but unfortunately it got nowhere this past year, partially because Borges is a Republican and we have a Democratic supermajority. But I think we can carry this across the finish line, and that's my goal. And so working across the aisle there to try to make it easier for small businesses to thrive here in the state. But we're here to talk about oil spills, so let's move on to that. Obviously we had the oil spill not so long ago just off the coast of Huntington Beach, and that is why we're all here today discussing whether or not it's appropriate to end drilling off the coast of California. We all think we're all stunned by that. I know Newport Beach, Huntington Beach, Laguna Beach all shut down their beaches for at least a week. And this had huge impacts on our local economies. I talked to a number of small business owners that had seen pretty significant drops immediately after the announcement of that oil spill. People canceled their hotel reservations. And if you were in Huntington, you know that there was the big air show that weekend, and they had to cancel the Sunday. There were 1.5 million tourists that were all of a sudden just decided to go home. And that obviously had a huge detrimental impact on Huntington's local economy. For me, I started thinking about this issue and immediately came to the conclusion that the amount of oil that we get off of our offshore drilling off the coast of California does not justify the constant risks to our coastal economy. California's coastline accounts for roughly $44 billion by some estimates annually in economic growth, economic activity. That's the tourism, it's the shopping, it's all the associated stuff that comes with having beautiful coastlines that people want to visit. At the same time, offshore oil production in state and federal waters accounts for less than 0.3% of U.S. annual oil production. So, you're talking about a very small percentage of oil. You're talking that will, I think, have little to no impact on oil prices in the country, in the state. At the same time, we can end this risk to our coasts. And our coasts are not just an economic driver, they're part of who we are as Californians, right? We think of ourselves as being a coastal state. We think of ourselves as being identified with our beautiful shores, with the beaches, with surfing, boogie boarding, or just walking along the beach. So called immediately for an end to all oil drilling. We called on our federal counterparts to end oil drilling in federal waters. And as I think many of you know, state waters go out to 3 miles. That's our jurisdiction. Beyond 3 miles is federal waters. So we have control over the portion up to 3 miles. The federal government has control beyond 3 miles. Now, under President Trump, we ended the moratorium. He lifted the moratorium on new oil drilling. Thankfully, due to the activism of a lot of Californians, no new leases were granted. But the fact is that we've actually not had a new lease for oil production, extraction or production or drilling given in state or federal waters off the coast of California since, I believe, 1982. And we haven't had one in state waters since 1969. So there is a lot of sturm and drang around ending new drilling, moratoriums on new drilling. But that's really not the problem. Every major oil spill we've had in like the last 40 years has come from existing leases. And if you look at those existing leases, and I've had a chance to review a couple, I've been in extensive talks with the administration, Governor Newsom's administration. Those leases essentially afford the holders of those leases a right in perpetuity to do new drilling and new extraction in the areas the leases cover, as long as it's economically viable. So when we talk about phasing out new drilling, when we talk about moratoriums, that's not getting to the root of the problem. The root of the problem is that as long as these leases exist, there will be drilling, and when there's drilling, particularly as things evolve over time, we're going to see lots of spilling. And the reason I say that is because what has happened at this point is the easy oil, and I'll let the oil guys speak about this later, and they can correct me, but my understanding is that the easy oil has now been taken. So what has happened is that the major companies like the Exxons and the Mobils have left, and they've sold their leases and their lease rights to smaller wildcat companies. So in California state waters right now, there's 3 platforms remaining. Oh, there's 4, but one is being decommissioned. That's the one off the coast of Santa Barbara, Platform Holly. The other 3, 2 of those are held and operated by a Texas company whose name D Corp. And one of them is held by a California company, California Resources Corporation. You've never heard of these guys probably because they're small, essentially wildcat operations, and there's serious concerns that they don't have the capital to pay for any costs that might arise if they have another oil spill, that they're not maybe the most responsible of actors. So, as I mentioned at the outset, the economics of this, I think, make clear what we have to do. And that's end all drilling, and that primarily means ending those leases that exist right now. Now, how do we do that? This gets into constitutional law, and I don't want to bore you all, but what I'd say is that we are going to have to pay off the holders of those leases. We're going to have to give them just compensation because we're taking something that is valuable, contractual rights to drill and extract oil, so we have to pay them. Now, the good news is these companies are also responsible for the costs of decommissioning these wells. And those costs can be significant. And what has happened in the past is that a lot of these companies have declared bankruptcy. They've walked away, and they've left the costs to the state to hold. So what we can do, I think, and this is what we're trying to do, our approach, the legislation that we'll try to introduce in January, is to have a net accounting. What do we owe you when we take both the net present value of all of your future profits from drilling and extraction, but we subtract from that the costs of decommissioning, that is capping the wells, cleaning it up, maybe removing some of the infrastructure. And so we think that with that, the costs of the state will be significantly less. They'll be very, very manageable. We're talking at this point about 11 leases left in California waters. We're talking about 3 platforms. 2 of them are off the coast of Huntington. 1 is off the coast of Seal Beach. In the new maps that they're showing for my redistricting, I will have the privilege of representing Huntington and Seal Beach, so they'll all be my problem. But I think we need to get rid of this problem, and I think there is a real pathway. So in the past weeks, I've been in discussions with the oil companies, the Western State Petroleum Association, or WSPA. I've been in contact with CRC, which is the California company that has leases in state waters. I've been in touch with the trade unions whose workers work in these oil areas. And they have all told me that they're going to be opposed, and I expect they will remain opposed. But we think there's a pathway to getting them so that they're not just trying all out to kill this bill. We think that there's a just and equitable way to do this, to try to transition those workers to clean energy jobs. And I guess I sort of close by saying this. I am a firm believer in climate science, that we are right now facing a climate emergency, and I think we're seeing the evidence of that. I am very much of the side that we need to take all action to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels. But I would say this, even if you don't agree with that, even if you completely disagree with that, I think the economics here of offshore drilling, it just does not make sense. And so I think this is something I'm hopeful we can get our colleagues behind, where we can find a pathway, and hopefully we can convince some of you to help out in building up the popular will to get behind this approach. But thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to the comments from my neighbors.
Does it work? Yeah. Good evening. Thank you for the invitation to come. This is, I think, my third or fourth time I've speak up Newport, each time on a different subject. But this is a subject that's near and dear to our heart. I can guarantee you two things. Since 1969, we've had 6 major oil spills in California, and I can guarantee you we will have more. The other thing that I can guarantee you is that when we do have another oil spill and you hear on the news the company that's responsible, I can guarantee you you've never heard of that company before, because they're small, as Dave said, they're small little companies. The big guys who built this, Chevron, Union, Arco, Exxon, they're gone. Chevron has some underlying leases, but basically they're out of it. And these platforms have been sold 3 and 4 and 5 times, and they're not economic today. Actually, we were involved, Orange County Coastkeeper was involved for a number of years in getting legislation, which we succeeded in getting legislation in 2012. And that was called AB 2503, and we worked it very hard. What it basically did is we recognized that at the time you couldn't just pass legislation to prohibit these operations. They're legitimate. The oil companies own them. They have assets, and you can't just go shut them down. And so what we learned early on is that the oil companies wanted them shut down and wanted a clear path to compliance as much as we wanted them shut down. It wasn't a conflict. It was just, how do we do it? And what we have found is that every platform out there, and there's still 27 platforms in California, every platform is basically has a date which they project they will decommission. And it's based on when are they going to be out of anything to pump. It's not based on where they are, the cost. What we're finding is that and we found then that they're operating in many, many cases, they're operating these platforms at a loss, but their back is to the wall. They're not pumping to any great degree. They're actually pumping down to a point on how can we stretch the time, because it's far cheaper, far less expensive for us to operate these at a loss than it is the faced $55, $100, $150 million in decommissioning. And so let's just ride this pony out. And it's not what they want, it's kind of what they're forced to do. So we found willing partners. We had many meetings with Chevron, and Chevron was a willing partner. I'm speaking with Chevron next Tuesday on this. And so what we came up with is a bill that we probably didn't market as best we could, but basically it was a bill that got the name Rigs to Reefs. And what it was is not all platforms, because they won't qualify, but after an extensive environmental biological assessment, if they were proven to be viable, productive reefs, then they could be cut off at 80 feet below the surface. You wouldn't have to put buoys up. The structure would transfer to the state. The oil company would always perpetually be responsible for the wellhead. And then actuaries would be brought in, and they would determine how much money is being saved by the oil company by not taking it out. And in the original legislation that we did, it was 65% of that amount of money you wrote a check to the state of California, and it went into an ocean restoration fund. And then by January 1st, 2023, that goes to 85%. But the point was, you know, the other aspect that we haven't mentioned is I'm on a board that we said, another board, not Coastkeeper, that we spent over $2 million in having studies done by Dr. Milton Love at Santa Barbara, by Dr. Chris Lowe at Long Beach, and by Dr. Dan Pandella at Occidental. And these are all marine biologists. And the issue was, are these things operating? Are they thriving reefs? Or as some environmental organizations said, they're like a telephone wire. A telephone wire supports birds, but you can't call it a bird habitat. and that's the analogy they use for these platforms. But we have now an abundance of science that shows that these are very productive reefs. That in 2014, there was a study done that said some of the, not all, some of the platforms off California's coast are the most productive habitats in the whole on the whole planet. And we all have had sea bass in our life. We've interacted with it, usually by eating it. And it's determined that 80% of California's sea bass population comes from oil platforms. And so they're thriving reefs. Two of those platforms are the largest marine structures in the world today. They are 1,100 feet. Keep in mind the Eiffel Tower's 898 feet, and the Empire State Building. But these are larger, and quite frankly, they don't know how to do it. It's never been done. And then you start looking at the carbon footprint and what is involved in taking them out. We put on a symposium in 2007 and 2010. We brought in actually the professionals from the Texas Gulf that dismantle oil platforms, and they basically said that the first thing you need is a 20-acre minimum waterfront site. So when you cut a piece off, you'd have to take it somewhere to clean it and cut it up. You know, it doesn't take any of us long to realize that there aren't any 20-acre waterfront sites available. And we might close it. Okay, I'm sorry.
Grab the other one.
I'm sorry. So, anyhow, there's a number of things involved. It would take multiple years once they were doing it. Where these platforms are, they only have 2 or 3 months they could actually work with an armada of boats because of the currents and the waves and the weather. And the thought was, okay, if there's no place to bring them on land, you have to build an enormous barge and tow them to some country that will allow them to be cut up, maybe China, maybe somewhere else. And then you start assessing, well, what is the carbon footprint of that? And stuff. And then you ask the basic question, how smart is it when we have declining world fish populations? How smart is it to take some of the most productive you have and blow them up and destroy them? So that was one alternative. We got caught up in pushing rigs to reef to the point to try to educate people. But under the legislation we did, the majority of the platforms would not qualify for a reef, and they would have to be completely removed. The ones in shallower waters would have to. But, you know, what this is a very complicated puzzle that has got to be worked out. Because like I said in the beginning, there are going to be more oil spills at horrible, catastrophic costs to us. And yet, the oil companies, you've got marginal companies operating them. They're stalling before they take them out. And what there isn't is a clear path to decommissioning. And so, from our standpoint, what we're going to undertake is how do we provide that clear path? And it's through collaboration. It's by sitting down with the oil companies, the legislature. It's by sitting down with the environmental community who back then was pretty much opposed to rigs to reefs, mainly because they thought the oil companies were getting something and not paying what they should pay. Things are different now. I've heard in the last month from other organizations that 10 years ago opposed this. We've got to the point now that they're willing to, the ideology has changed. It wasn't you got to take them out and nothing rigs to reef. It's now we need to stop oil production. We need to stop them. And if rigs to reefs works, fine. If it doesn't, then remove them. But either one is fine. Let's just stop the oil production. And that's kind of where we're headed and what we're going to try to do. But it's going to have to be a collaboration with the oil industry, not against them, and bringing in the legislature and everybody else. So I did this for too long, so I can hardly introduce myself in 10 minutes. So I'm done.
They're not getting their slides yet. We didn't get ours up the whole time.
Oh, they're not going up?
Yeah.
Start when you start talking.
So,
No, they need to switch the source. When we're showing that camera, we're not showing that.
that's too bad.
Yeah.
I have some wonderful pictures here to show you. But apparently apparently they're not going to go up there. So, this comes down to we had an oil spill the 1st of October. And that oil spill was significant. People saw the... So we're not going to get this fixed. Okay.
Do you want to use this?
No, I'll just do that. 1, 2, 3. There we go. So we had a spill, 1st of October. And I went out because my background, as you heard my deal, is I'm a petroleum engineer, and I've worked around this business in California for over 40 years. But more important than that, I'm a surfer. And I've surfed for a lot longer than I've been involved in the oil business. And I'll tell you one thing, when something happens like that, I'm ticked off. Because I could not go surf because they closed the beach. I thought, I got to get down there and take a look. So on the 3rd of October, I went down and walked right around the 60th and 70th Street on the Newport Peninsula. And I saw some, quarter-size balls of tar. And they're a little shinier than normal because they were fresh, because they came from that platform. So we think that spill, the big number was 100,000 gallons. The small number is 25,000 gallons. Still sounds like a lot of oil. Well, I just want to pass on to you that I took a walk, surprisingly, right after the pandemic. Remember when we all locked down, couldn't get out of our houses, you couldn't park at the beach? I was ticked. I couldn't go surfing. But I walked on that same stretch of beach. It just happens to be, and the photos that I have in my deal were photos I took of the beach. Because on the beach that day were huge globules of tar. And I'll tell you, and I know you won't want to believe me because I'm the least trusted guy in the room as an oil executive, but trust me as a surfer that the oil globules were larger, and I went up to the lifeguard tower and I said, this is pretty bad. What's the source? Is somebody, one of these tankers or something let loose out there? And the guy says, no, it's a natural oil seep that's offshore here. It goes off once in a while, and we got a big slug of oil. So the reason I bring that up is you really have to stand back and look at the big numbers before you get really uptight. Now this spill, I'm still mad about it. I'm not sure it was the fault of the oil company on the platform or a big anchor from all those damn container ships out there. But that aside, you have to put this in context. I'm not going to say it's trivial, but if you go to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association's website, that is a government agency, part of the Commerce Department. We have over 100 oil seeps off of the coast of California. Annually, on an average basis, they put 5 million gallons of oil into the California marine ecosystem. 5 million, as low as 1 million some years, as high as 9 million some years. It's been studied over and over again how to stop it. The industry tried to stop a big one off of Santa Barbara by putting a gigantic sombrero over it. We called it a sombrero to funnel it up to where you could gather the oil and mitigate some of the damage. But this has been going on for thousands of years. Why does it happen? We have these things in California called faults. They come to the surface. A great example, y'all been to the La Brea tar pits? A big natural oil seep. You hear that word Brea? The town of Brea? Brea, Spanish, tar. There are oil seeps all along the Whittier foothills. That's where they figured out where to drill. So if you go back offshore and you look at, we've had 2 incidents from offshore platforms. I'll beg to differ. There have been 6 incidents along the coast, but one was a tanker running into a bridge in San Francisco. One was a tanker running over its anchor off of Huntington Beach. One was a pipeline that was up on a bluff in Santa Barbara that broke, carrying oil from onshore production. And 2 have been from platforms. Santa Barbara Channel, the platform in 1969, and this most recent one. My point about talking about natural seeps is they've been going on for thousands of years. Oh, by the way, if you look at the navigator's log from James Cook, Captain Cook, in the 1700s, they anchored off Santa Barbara. And the navigator recorded in the log, as far as they could see, a tar-like substance on the surface and a horrible smell. So this is part of our natural environment. This stuff's called crude oil. It's a natural substance, comes out of the ground, and our ecosystem has been thriving for thousands of years as this has gone on.
I'll be brief because we're splitting 10 minutes here, but I'm a California native born and raised in San Diego. I'm 38 years old. 37 of the years I've lived here, California has consumed over 600 million barrels of oil every year. The only year that was less than 600 million barrels was last year because we were locked in our homes, and we still consumed 485 million barrels of oil. So this demand is not going to be reduced by eliminating production from an offshore platform. Expected demand, according to the EIA, another government agency, factoring in Governor Newsom's ban on internal combustions in 2035, still projects that California will consume over 1 million barrels of oil every day. California operators produce roughly 400,000 barrels of oil a day. So we can chip away at California oil production all we want, but all that does is result in more of our product coming from overseas via tanker. And I will note that 7 of the 10 largest oil spills in United States water have been the result of tankers. So if we're going to have a conversation about risk and oil, it's the oil that's floating on our water, not the oil being produced by California operators that produce it in the most stringent regulatory climate in the world, bar none. One final thing I'll say. Right now, there's 7 oil tankers off our coast right here, holding 5.8 million barrels of oil right now sitting on our coast. That's over 1.4 million barrels than the offshore platforms produced all year. We produce roughly 4.4 million barrels of oil from our offshore platforms all year. So you have more oil sitting on the water out here because we're pushing our production overseas and we're bringing it back on the dirtiest vessels that you can bring it back on. So we need to have a very open and honest conversation about where the risks are coming from and the biggest risks are coming from overseas. And unfortunately, us as Californians are buying more crude out of the Amazon rainforest than any other place on earth because we are trying to limit the production domestically. And it's very tragic and it's very sad, but we all need to have a very open, honest conversation about this. And thank you very much for having us here.
All right, so we're going to open it up for some questions and answers here. We've got two folks with microphones. If you have a question, I'll call on you and speak into the microphone so we can hear your question clearly. So anyone have a question they would like to ask? Right there, Debbie.
Okay, I'll start. So what happened? I mean, nobody's talked about what actually happened on the platform. I mean, my understanding is that an anchor ran over a pipeline. So, you know, a little bit more information about what actually happened and what actually was released would be helpful to the conversation. Thank you.
I'll just chime in first and say, you know, the pipeline going to shore from where the platforms are in the middle of the San Pedro Channel go along the separation zone between the incoming and outgoing tanker traffic coming into the LA harbor. The pipeline goes in that route and then cuts in and comes onto land about where the Queen Mary is in the harbor. It's buried about 4 to 5 feet under the seabed. But a big anchor on one of these ships, 30 tons, can penetrate 10 feet. If the ship drifts, the pipeline gets pulled, and there, you know, it's amazing. The pipeline got pulled at least 100 feet out of its trench by the ship's anchor. And I don't think we've got any more details because the Coast Guard's still investigating the what really happened.
I would just follow up and say, you know, there is an investigation based on previous oil spills. It's going to take some time before they publicly release official findings. There is the theory that has not been denied by Unified Command or the U.S. Coast Guard that there was an anchor, although I was told that this was not buried, that at closer to Long Beach it was buried, but farther out where this particular breach happened, it was exposed, and so it was not buried at all. You know, again, we're not sure. We will not know for sure for some months until they have an official report come out.
Okay, another question over here.
Oh, okay.
Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say that where this incident happened, the pipe was not buried. The pipe is encased in concrete, but it lays on top of the ocean floor, and it was dragged 104 feet is what they estimate by an anchor, and they believe it was dragged months before the actual rupture, and so, you know, but. What we're talking about, and when we talk about California, you can separate what was from an oil platform or what was from a pipe or whatever. It's all oil operation. And I think that's what concerns a lot of people in California. The Santa Barbara has had some huge spills. And whether it's the pipe that leads to a platform or the platform or possibly even a tanker, if it wasn't for oil operations, none of that would be there or be necessary. So we are not anti-oil. To me, the overarching question is how much actually comes from offshore production, a tiny, tiny, minute amount of the oil supply you're talking about. And nobody's suggesting. Go ahead. No, that's right. I'm done.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing, and I just wanted to respond to some of the comments made because I mentioned Unified Command, and so we had a very robust response that was extraordinarily effective in containing this oil spill. And so I will say that I agree with, I'm sorry, was it Dave's point that this was not as bad as it could have been. But make no mistake, the first estimates we had were that it would be on scale with Refugio. And that spill in Santa Barbara in 2015 was enormous and by no means could be compared to seepages that happen naturally. That closed down their beaches for 6 months. It had hundreds of millions, maybe billions of dollars in economic impact. And so, Originally our fears were that this was going to be about 140,000 gallons as well, similar to Refugio, and that we were out there. And I think based on the fact that it was much smaller spill than we had originally anticipated, based on the extraordinary response of federal and state and local responders, we were able to really boom up and prevent this from being much worse than it could have been. But I guess my overarching point is, this is going to happen again, I'd echo Garry, unless we end offshore drilling. And to the point of oil production, again, echoing his point, this is a tiny, tiny amount of oil. Nobody up here is talking about ending oil production on land, which is the bulk of California oil production. We're talking about offshore drilling, which again is just not, the bang is not there for the buck. And I think anyone looking at this objectively would probably come to the same conclusion.
Okay, one more back there. Then she'll be next.
Me? Oh,
Yes.
hello. Two things. One, I was out there that day. We were sailing back from Catalina and ran into the Coast Guard. And we were lucky because there was offshore wind. So most of the mariners who were coming back from Moonstone, which is Newport Harbor Yacht Club, or White's Cove, which is Balboa Yacht Club, we were coming straight across, and we were detoured with the Coast Guard, who had got the sweepers out, these sorts of things. It was a massive amount of oil out there. So whether it came on shore in little globs or big globs, I can tell you from a mariner's point of view and a sailor, it was everywhere out there on the surface of the water. And we got very lucky because there was a storm and it was an offshore wind and it got blown out to sea. It could have been blown onshore. So you're at the mercy of the wind, but that's just an aside. That's why we didn't have it as bad as we thought here. The second thing is the frequency. We saw pictures. The people are very active in the yacht clubs around here looking at pictures. We saw pictures of the pipeline, and we heard from a person who investigates this. There's I guess, little mini submarines or underwater cameras. But I was very concerned about what I heard, which was the frequency of these inspections. They are only required to inspect, from what I understand, or what they told us, the pipelines or these conduits.
Can you get to the question?
Yes. How often are they inspected? Who inspects them? And there is no really third-party inspection. The Coast Guard doesn't go along with them or do any of this kind of inspection. So I'd like to propose that they get inspected at least as often as we have to do JACO in a hospital, and have them inspected every year.
Inspected every year. But one thing to note too, when you're talking about pressures of a pipeline, they're constantly monitored. So if they're seeing a pressure drop in that line, that's going to get communicated back to their computer system. So I don't know that you necessarily need to look at it from of course they need to be inspected, but someone on that platform is always looking at the pressure. Not picking up, or maybe there's a situation where maybe there's an alarm, but they say, okay, well, we'll wait for the next readout. Maybe the next readout was good and the pressures are good. I don't know. I'm not an engineer, but those things are constantly monitored. It's not like they're not monitoring the pipeline.
Okay,
I've been told that they are inspected every year. One year will be internal, and the next year will be external. And the state is responsible for overseeing that. I don't know who actually executes the inspection, but there is that. And I guess, to the point of the exposed pipe, we're not going to know what happened with the pressure drops, and those are big questions. That's something that is very curious to anybody following the facts of what happened. Is why was it? I think it was more than just a couple hours. It was apparently from all night to the next morning. And they reported, the company reported that they did not detect anything until a visual inspection at 9 a.m. And they said there was no sensors that detected anything. So this is something that we will not probably know for at least another 6 months.
Okay, Dennis had a question. Ronnie, can you give him the mic?
Hi, okay, I'm gonna bring it back to economics because at the end of the day, that really what it all comes back to. So Senator Min, you talked about this whole economic thing, and Gary, you've talked about working with the oil companies. So I'm very pleased to hear that that's the direction. I want to be clear. Am I correct that we're talking about 3 rigs? We're talking about the state rigs only. Okay. So everything I've read so far, it's not a matter of if the state of California is going to pick up the cost for decommissioning, it's when. Because as happened up at Refugio and which we may see on this one, lawsuits and so on, they'll just go bankrupt and it ends up the state's going to pick it up anyway. So I would like you just to elaborate a little bit more with what type of the legislation might be, and then maybe, Gary, how the oil companies or the representatives from that industry, I'd like to really see it working together. You know, let's just focus on these 3. We don't have control over the federals, and let's come right back down to the economics. How much is it going to cost us, the taxpayers of the state of California?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and we're still looking into some of the numbers. And I should say the rigs to there are 3 platforms in state waters that there's 4 actually. There's Holly in Santa Barbara, but that's being decommissioned right now. And there's 1 in Seal Beach and 2 off of Huntington Beach. So when we talk about oil platforms in state waters that under current leases, there's 3 right now that are not being actively decommissioned. You know, as far as where we want to go with this, first, the rigs to reef can be part of the approach here, and it should be part of the approach. But basically, what we're anticipating is a bill that would just cancel these leases. We're told that there's 2 clauses in the Constitution that this will run into. The contracts clause, which should not be an issue according to the lawyers that we've talked to. The second one, though, the unjust takings. So if you take anything of value from somebody, you have to give them just compensation. That's the one that we have to deal with. So we do have to give the holders of these leases some economic value. But to Gary's point, it should be a net calculation because, you know, if you are responsible for certain costs, and that's part of the contract, which is part of these leases, but at the same time you generate revenue, you don't just get to claim the revenue and the profits, you also have to account for the cleanup. Now, I talked with CRC at length, and they claim that they make about $20 to $30 million a year in revenues from their one platform that they hold, and that's about $10 to $15 million in profits. So you do kind of a net present value calculation of that, and you can come to, depending on your discount rate, maybe that's 50, maybe that's 100, maybe that's $200 million in potential profits. But then they said that the costs of decommissioning for them would be about $20 to $30 million. So you subtract that out. So, you know, the numbers, you know, could be bigger, could be smaller, depending on how you do this. One thing that we've talked about with some of the lawyers we're working with is about a process that actually articulates some of the factors that should be considered, maybe hands it over to the Lands Commission to determine what is owed to each oil company or what they owe us. But we want to create a robust process that will withstand any kind of litigation. We expect that this will be challenged, but if we think if we do this well and provide a fair process and one that is done ex ante in consultation with the different stakeholders, that we can have a pathway here. But given that we're expecting really record surpluses this year as far as tax revenue, it's going to be another banner year. We think this is the right time to do this. It's 3 platforms, and then we can tell the federal government, hey, now it's your turn with the other 24, 23 platforms out there.
We're not talking about Beta that was struck by an anchor caused by a cargo ship. We're talking about 3 different platforms? Beta's federal. So, okay. Because we based a lot of the conversation about a spill hit by a ship anchor, not the fault of the oil company, from what we can tell. But I think what we're setting up is a very dangerous precedent in saying, you know, you're making $30 million a year, but you haven't had a spill. Something's happened over there, so we're going to shut this platform down because we don't feel like $20 to $30 million that you're making totally legally is fair. And it kind of harkens back to how we're dealing with everything as a society right now, that, okay, we were going to stay home for 15 days to stop the spread of something. 600 days later, we're still dealing with it. So I think it's a very slippery slope to say, okay, these 3 state platforms have never had an issue, but we're going to shut them down because a ship anchor, because our ports are overrun, ran over a line. And I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a constitutional lawyer, but that seems like a very slippery slope. And what it sends the message to anybody doing business in this state is, I'm going to leave. Why do we have CRC? Because Occidental Petroleum said, let me get out of California to escape this madness. I'm going to drop all my assets into CRC and go to Houston. So I think it's very easy to say, oh, well, we'll just shut you down. We'll pencil out what you're worth and goodbye. But the fact of the matter is those 3 state platforms, correct me if I'm wrong, they haven't had an issue. So why would we shut down something that has had no issue?
My first response was, yes, you are wrong. Esther and Seal Beach has had problems, and they've had spills years. And so I want to tell you the counter, which is going on today. There's a Chevron built, and it was sold and resold, Platform Holly. Platform Holly had a major oil spill and in the pipes. And they never reopened Platform Holly. What Veneco, the owner operator at the time, decided to do was declare bankruptcy. They declared bankruptcy. Then they told State Lands Commission that we're leaving, we're abandoning it. It's your problem. And so today that's been on stall. The state is trying to plug some of the 30 wells under that platform. And the taxpayers of California have spent $65 million so far, and we haven't begun to actually dismantle the platform. And so times however many, that's why we need to work with the oil companies, because what people don't realize is when these things were entitled, the oil companies wanted to build them, and the state of California wanted them to be built. They wanted the oil, they wanted the revenue. So all the laws were based on how can we be accommodating to the oil companies. And today, when the spectrum is different, the laws are still accommodating to the oil companies. They essentially can declare bankruptcy and walk away, and California taxpayers will be left holding the bag.
If I could just follow up as well. Look, just to state my goals here, I do want the oil companies out of business in 15 years, but not because we're mandating you to be out of business, but rather because we're investing in alternative sources of energy that wean us off of fossil fuels as quickly as possible. I think that is critical for the future of our civilization. And I hope we can actually work with the oil companies on things like offshore wind, where there's a lot of the similar expertise as offshore oil extraction. But to this point, first, as a former law professor, I'll tell you, there's kind of a saying that any time somebody gives a slippery slope argument, it means they don't have a better argument, right? Because you're saying that, like, we're going to pass a whole bunch of other bills, and I don't have any intention of doing that. One of the first things I said to the Western State Petroleum Association and to the Building and Trades that I met with was, I will promise you right now, I'm not going to run a single bill this year or the next 3 years that is going to try to end onshore, on land oil production or extraction. That's not my goal here, right? And the arguments you've made that, we are going to export more oil from abroad, those are not totally crazy arguments. And I buy into that. But at the same time, offshore drilling and extraction presents unique dangers to our economy. And again, this is just about risks and reward. And I'd love to hear kind of the comeback to this argument that the risks to our coastal economy, which are $44 billion a year, are worth, this, whatever you want to call it, 20 to 30 million more. It is a tiny, tiny fraction of overall U.S. oil production. It's a tiny fraction of California oil production. So why do we put up with this when it brings unique risks to our beautiful coasts?
Okay, we got time for one more question. Seymour?
Yeah, I've got a question for you, petroleum engineer type guys, and this has to do with risk. If you modify a gas station, or in my case, a marine fuel dock, you have to install double-walled piping, leak detection systems, automatic shutoffs, all that kind of thing. And relative to our recent leak up off Huntington Beach, I have heard that that's a single-walled, 16-inch pipe carrying crude oil. It's not double-walled. The leak detection system's obviously inadequate because there was a long delay before anybody was alerted. And I'm just wondering why this technology hasn't been employed in this underwater the piping that goes in from oil islands a long time ago. What's the deal?
I think your question revolves around so you want a double-lined pipeline, or what? I can understand the tanks where we have that all in gas stations, places around, but
yeah, the technology for double wall pipes isn't brand new. It could have been done a long time ago. I'm just wondering why it wasn't done, and if there are any new installations, is that part of the regulation now that you have to double wall pipe and have leak detection and have automatic shut off? I mean, it's basic stuff.
I think a lot of the stuff you're talking about exists right now on that pipeline with automatic shutoffs that are triggered by pressure, and that pipeline was, steel pipeline with a cement sheath around it to be protected in the environment it's in. And as long as nobody runs over it, it works fine. But it's a hazard, from the standpoint of what happened. It's kind of unprecedented what's going out in San Pedro Bay right now with 75 ships anchoring all over the place. And I think the pipeline was just fine. It was the subject of something that nobody planned on because nobody's supposed to anchor where that pipeline is. It's in the separation zone. So I guess we've missed one of the big issues here. So if we get rid of all the platforms, that's great. I'm a surfer. I love the idea. Only problem is Mother Nature's still putting 5 million gallons a year into the ocean. So figure that out.
All right.
I guess
Go
if I
ahead,
could just
David.
follow up, one thing I would just note is that the infrastructure on a lot of these platforms is really old. And these thinly capitalized wildcat companies that are operating most of these platforms today really don't have either the capital or the incentives to reinvest in the infrastructure. And so I think it really is a ticking time bomb, and we will see many more oil spills unless we get rid of these platforms, because there's no incentive for anyone to invest. And it's just the infrastructure goes back to the 60s and 70s when these platforms were originally established.
All right, let's give these guys a hand. That was a really good discussion. I want to apologize for the goof up on the PowerPoint presentations. I'm looking at these slides; they're actually very pretty, so very, very nice. It's just that you can't see them, but we're in the process of transitioning from just being on Zoom to this combination thing. So we had a communication problem with our control room. So anyway, I want to apologize to our speakers that put a lot of work into these PowerPoints for not being able to do that. But it was a terrific program, and we really appreciate you guys taking the time and coming and sharing your views with us. So thank you very much. Just a few final thoughts here. I want to thank the Bungalow for their work. Support the Bungalow. They always help us out every month. No program in December. Mayor's Dinner's February the 10th. You'll be seeing the announcements on that coming out pretty soon. So our next program is going to be January 12th, 2022. So watch for our announcements on the subject matter. I assure you it'll be something very interesting. So good night.